At 95 years old, Clint Eastwood is still a living legend. For more than 7 decades he defined American cinema, the quiet outlaw, the unshakable detective, the director who turned regret into art. To audiences around the world, he wasn't just a star. He was resilience itself, the last great cowboy of Hollywood. But behind the image that made him unforgettable is a man who has endured more than the public ever knew. His childhood was marked by instability, his relationships by betrayal and loss. He survived a plane crash that nearly killed him, outlived lovers who once defined his life, and carried the weight of distance from his own children. At an age when few remain standing, Eastwood finds himself surrounded not by applause, but by silence. So what is the true tragedy of Clint Eastwood's final years? How did the man who seemed indestructible on screen become so vulnerable in life? And why does his story even now leave audiences with a heartbreak deeper than any role he ever played? Clint Eastwood's story doesn't begin with the red carpets or the booming box office. It begins in 1930, in San Francisco, during one of the hardest decades in American history. The Great Depression shaped him before he could even form memories. His parents, Clinton Sr. and Ruth, struggled to keep the family afloat. Work was never stable, money was always scarce, and the Eastwoods were constantly on the move. By the time Clint was 10 years old, he had already lived in more than a dozen towns along the West Coast. Every time he unpacked, he knew it wouldn't be for long. That instability etched into him a lesson he never forgot: nothing lasts, and no one can guarantee tomorrow. Even his arrival in the world carried weight. At birth he weighed more than 11 pounds, so large that nurses nicknamed him Samson. The name suggested strength, but Clint's childhood was anything but heroic. His father drifted from one short-term job to another, as a steel worker. His mother, strict and demanding, kept the family together but ruled with discipline that left Clint cautious and withdrawn. He learned early not to rely on others. Not because they didn't care, but because life itself was too fragile. School offered no refuge. Teachers found him restless, difficult, and uninterested in lessons. Eventually, he was expelled from Piedmont High School for carving crude drawings into school property. On the surface, he looked like a rebellious boy, a troublemaker destined for little more than odd jobs. But beneath that label was a teenager carrying the weight of displacement, isolation, and confusion about where he belonged. Later in life, when interviewers asked him about those years, he would say simply, "You learn not to get attached, because nothing stays." It was not just a remark, it was the foundation of his stoic presence that later defined the silent cowboys and hard-edged detectives he brought to life on screen. Yet in the middle of that turbulence, Clint found something that gave him discipline and direction. At 12 years old, he sat down at a piano and began teaching himself how to play. With no formal instruction, he spent hours pressing the keys until his fingers were sore and bleeding. The pain didn't deter him, it motivated him. Music became his first language of endurance, a way to create order in a world that felt unpredictable. That cracked bench and battered keyboard in the family garage meant more to him than applause or recognition. It gave him control, and it gave him focus. Still, tragedy struck again in an unexpected way. In 1951, while serving in the U.S. Army, Clint was aboard a military aircraft that malfunctioned and was forced into a crash landing off the California coast near Point Reyes. There were no life vests, no quick rescues, only the open sea. Clint had to swim 2 miles through freezing currents to reach shore. Each stroke became a battle against exhaustion, each breath a fight for survival. He made it, but the memory never left him. Years later, he admitted the experience made him realize how quickly life can be taken away. From that day forward, he lived with urgency, never wanting to waste a moment. That survival wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. Clint Eastwood would carry it into every chapter of his life. On film sets, he became famous for his efficiency, finishing productions ahead of schedule. To colleagues, it looked like discipline, but in reality, it was the echo of that night at sea. A man determined not to waste time because he knew how fragile time really was. The boy who grew up in silence, rejection, and instability had every reason to fade into obscurity. Yet those early tragedies forged his armor. They gave him a resilience few could match, and a quiet intensity that would later draw millions to his performances. But resilience has a price. It built a man who could survive anything, and at the same time, a man who often stood alone. And that raises the question that defines Clint Eastwood's life: can survival itself become a tragedy when it leaves you unable to truly connect? When Clint Eastwood returned from military service in the early 1950s, he had no clear path. Hollywood wasn't waiting for him. He had no formal training, no connections, and no polished charm that casting directors loved. Instead, he was tall, reserved, and awkward. Studio executives dismissed him as too stiff or too quiet. Some told him his Adam's apple was too large, others that he simply didn't have the charisma for the screen. For years, Clint lingered in the margins of the industry, appearing in tiny, uncredited roles, so invisible that even when the films played, he could barely spot himself on screen. But Clint had something the Hollywood system overlooked: persistence. While others pushed their way into parties and tried to impress with charm, Clint studied. He watched actors, learned their timing, and refined his own sense of stillness. Where others filled silence with nervous chatter, Clint learned to let silence do the talking. In a town overflowing with noise, he stood apart. The break finally came in 1959, when he was cast in the CBS Western Rawhide. At first, the role of Rowdy Yates wasn't meant to be significant, a sidekick character, little more than background to the show's lead, Eric Fleming. But something happened on screen. Audiences noticed Eastwood's presence. He didn't overact. He didn't try to steal scenes. He simply held himself with a quiet intensity that drew the camera. Within a few years, Rawhide turned him into a household name, though not yet the superstar he would become. Even then, Clint carried the sense of being an outsider. "I've always felt like I was on the edge of things," he admitted years later. That feeling never left him, even as fame began to build. It was visible in the way he held himself on set, tall, stoic, slightly apart from the others. He wasn't chasing applause. He was enduring. The true turning point came when Italian director Sergio Leone spotted his work and cast him in a low-budget European Western, A Fistful of Dollars, in 1964. At first, Clint was skeptical. The role required almost no dialogue. Why would anyone care about a cowboy who barely spoke? But the silence, the stillness, that was Clint's language. What Leone saw was exactly what had defined Eastwood since childhood: a man who communicated more in a stare than in a speech. The film exploded internationally, followed by For a Few Dollars More and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Together, these became known as the Dollars Trilogy. And they didn't just make Clint Eastwood famous, they redefined the Western. No longer were cowboys noble heroes. Under Leone's vision, and through Eastwood's performance, they became morally gray, unpredictable, dangerous, and unforgettable. The Man with No Name wasn't a role Clint played. It was a reflection of the boy who had grown up never quite belonging, surviving by observation and silence. But stardom came with paradox. The bigger he became, the more he felt like an outsider. Even when fans mobbed him and studios clamored for him, he confessed that he often felt invisible, as if he were watching the spectacle from a distance. That sense of detachment became the foundation for the characters he chose: men standing alone against the world, men who were respected, feared, even admired, but never fully known. By the end of the 1960s, Clint Eastwood had gone from a struggling extra to one of the most recognized faces in global cinema. Yet, behind the fame was the same restless solitude. He had proven Hollywood wrong, but he hadn't silenced the questions inside himself. Success didn't erase loneliness. If anything, it magnified it. And that tension, between a man adored by millions but deeply alone, became the thread that would carry into every film he touched. It set the stage for the next chapter of his life, when Clint Eastwood stopped letting others control his image and stepped behind the camera to finally tell stories his own way. Because for Clint, fame wasn't the destination. It was only the beginning of a deeper search, not for applause, but for meaning. By the early 1970s, Clint Eastwood was already a global star. The Dollars trilogy had made him famous in Europe, Rawhide had built his name in America, and Dirty Harry would soon cement his image as Hollywood's toughest lawman. But inside, Clint was restless. He had spent years embodying characters. Others wrote for him, filmed the way others directed him, and edited to fit the visions of studio executives. It didn't sit well. He had survived too much in life to let others dictate the meaning of his work. What he wanted now was control. Directing wasn't about ego, it was about independence. I just didn't want someone telling me how to feel anymore, he would admit in rare moments of honesty. In 1971, he took that leap with Play Misty for Me, a psychological thriller about obsession and manipulation. It was hardly a safe debut. The film tackled dark themes that mirrored Clint's own battles with trust, control, and emotional vulnerability. Critics didn't fully grasp it at the time, but the move signaled a turning point. Clint Eastwood was no longer just an actor, he was shaping his own stories. From that point on, his reputation behind the camera grew. On set, he was known for a directing style that mirrored his own survivalist discipline. He shot quickly, rarely demanded multiple takes, and refused to waste time or money. Where other directors filled days with chatter and endless revisions, Clint valued silence, precision, and efficiency. To outsiders, it looked like cost-cutting. To those who knew him, it was the same urgency that had carried him out of the freezing waters at Point Reyes decades earlier. He couldn't stand wasting a moment. The 80s and 90s saw him directing films that slowly stripped away the myth of the Western hero he once embodied. Unforgiven in 1992 was the culmination of that process. It was not a celebration of violence but an unflinching look at its consequences. Clint not only starred but also directed, creating a film that questioned everything Hollywood had ever glamorized about cowboys and gunfighters. The Academy recognized it with Oscars for Best Picture and Best Director. For Clint, the victory wasn't the awards, it was being heard. He carried that same honesty into Million Dollar Baby in 2004. Playing a hardened boxing trainer, he poured decades of his own guarded tenderness and regret into the role. The film won him another Best Director and Best Picture Oscar. But the performance, quiet and broken, showed more of the real Clint Eastwood than audiences had ever seen before. When his character whispered words of resignation in the final act, it wasn't just acting. It was a lifetime speaking through him. As the years went on, films like Gran Torino 2008, The Mule 2018, and Cry Macho 2021 continued the pattern. The characters were grizzled, weary, carrying guilt, but still standing tall. They weren't traditional heroes. They were fragments of Clint himself, scarred men who endured because they had no other choice. Yet, directing didn't make him more talkative. On his sets, Clint was famously soft-spoken, often issuing directions with only a nod or a single word. Crew members sometimes found him distant, but those closest understood. He had always spoken through images more than words. For Clint, storytelling was confession. Every frame was a piece of himself, revealed without ever having to explain. And still, he kept going. In his 80s and 90s, when others long since retired, Clint continued to direct films. Not for fame, not for money, but perhaps to keep ahead of the silence. Even now, his work is less about entertainment and more about leaving behind a record, a body of films that reflect resilience, regret, and the fragile strength of endurance. For Clint Eastwood, directing wasn't ambition, it was survival. A way to keep speaking, long after words failed him. And in that choice lies another layer of tragedy, that his deepest truths were never spoken aloud, only hidden in the shadows of the stories he created. Clint Eastwood's personal life has always been as complex as the characters he played. On screen, he was the lone cowboy or the stoic detective, standing apart from the world. Off-screen, the same distance often defined his relationships. For all the acclaim and admiration he received, intimacy never came easily. Behind the hardened image was a man who struggled to stay close to the people who mattered most. His first great anchor was Maggie Johnson, whom he married in 1953. At the time, Clint was a struggling actor, working odd jobs, unsure if Hollywood would ever take him seriously. Maggie believed in him when few others did. She stayed steady as he pursued auditions that led nowhere, raising their 2 children, Kyle in 1968 and Allison in 1972, through the lean years. For her it was loyalty, for Clint it was security. But fame has a way of testing even the strongest bonds. When Rawhide turned him into a television star, Clint's absences grew. Long shoots, late nights, and growing opportunities pulled him further away from home. As his star rose, temptations multiplied. Affairs began not just once, but repeatedly, and sometimes leading to children outside of marriage. Kimber, born in 1964 with actress Roxanne Tunis, was the first. Others followed: Scott, Catherine, Francesca, and Morgan, each from different relationships. In time, it became clear that Clint Eastwood's private life was scattered across households, cities, and generations. For Maggie, the betrayals were devastating. She tried to hold on for their children and for the man she had believed in, but the fractures ran too deep. By 1984, after 3 decades of marriage, the two divorced quietly. There were no dramatic court battles, no explosive headlines, only a settlement that reflected how far their lives had drifted. Maggie left with her dignity intact, but for Clint, the cost was more than financial. He had lost the woman who had known him before the fame, before the spotlight, before the fractures. In later years, when asked, he rarely spoke of Maggie, but in his films, especially those from the 1980s, the grief surfaced, characters weighed down by regret, isolation, and the quiet pain of choices that couldn't be undone. After Maggie, Clint's most defining relationship came with actress Sandra Locke. They met on the set of The Outlaw Josie Wales in 1972, and for the next 14 years they were inseparable, at least to the outside world. Their partnership was creative, romantic, and deeply turbulent. Locke once described him as both the love of her life and her greatest source of pain. What began with intensity soon became controlling. Reports later suggested Clint kept a firm grip on many aspects of her life, even down to career decisions. Their relationship collapsed under the weight of affairs, betrayals, and eventually, lawsuits. Locke accused him of sabotaging her career, leading to a bitter legal battle that dragged on for years. Though Clint settled, the wounds never healed. Locke's death from cancer in 2018 reopened those scars. Clint made no public statement, sent no flowers, offered no words. But those close to him insist her passing left him haunted. She had been the one who saw him at his most raw, unguarded, and conflicted. Losing her meant losing the chance for reconciliation, for the apology she said she always waited for. That silence became another ghost in Clint's life, another tragedy of words left unspoken. In his later years, however, Clint found something different with Christina Sandera. They met in the early 2000s at his Mission Ranch property, where she worked as a hostess. By 2014, she had moved in with him. Unlike the chaos of his earlier relationships, Christina offered calm and constancy. She was not an actress, not a public figure, but simply a companion who cared for Clint as a man, not a legend. For nearly a decade, she gave him stability he had never truly known. But in July 2024, tragedy struck once more. Christina died suddenly at 61, leaving Clint, then 94, shattered. At her small private service, he was seen standing silently at the edge, unshaven, motionless, his grief visible even without words. This loss returned him once again to solitude. Neighbors reported the blinds drawn at Mission Ranch, the piano Christina once played sitting untouched, her belongings left where she had last placed them. For a man who had built his legacy on control, the final years of his personal life became marked by absence. He had survived betrayal, lawsuits, and scandal. But the silence after Christina's passing was the most devastating of all. And here lies one of the greatest contradictions of Clint Eastwood's life. He could hold the attention of millions, yet struggled to hold on to the people closest to him. His personal story is not one of villainy, but of distance. A man who endured, but often endured alone. At 95, Clint Eastwood lives in the quiet coastal town of Carmel by the Sea, California. It is here, at Mission Ranch, a property he restored in the 1980s, that he spends most of his days. The land is open and serene, with sheep grazing under wide skies and the Pacific Ocean stretching in the distance. To visitors, it looks like paradise. But to Clint, it is something more complicated. A sanctuary filled with memories, some comforting, many painful. Every corner of Mission Ranch carries echoes of the people he has lost. For decades, Eastwood built his life on discipline. He avoided heavy drinking, kept a lean and green diet, and practiced meditation long before it became popular. Even in his 90s, he sticks to routines, light exercise, strength training adapted to his age, and long walks across his property. His body is weathered, his frame lean, but observers note that he still moves with a surprising steadiness. This endurance is no accident. Clint watched his father die young in 1970, a loss he blamed partly on lifestyle. Determined not to repeat that fate, he embraced clean living, and it carried him further than most could have imagined. And yet, time cannot be conquered. Reports in recent years confirm fatigue, reduced mobility, and a reliance on staying close to home. He avoids flying, traveling mostly by car when he leaves Carmel. Public appearances are rare, and when they happen, fans notice the changes. The thinning hair, the lined skin, the way his once piercing eyes now often look clouded with age. To millions who grew up watching him as the indestructible cowboy or the unflinching detective, seeing him frail is a reminder that even legends cannot escape time. But the deeper weight of his later years is not physical, it is emotional. In 2024, the death of his partner Christina Sandera left him devastated. For nearly a decade, she had been his anchor, offering the quiet companionship he had missed for most of his life. When she died suddenly of heart complications, Clint's solitude became more profound. Neighbors and friends noted the drawn blinds, the silence inside the house, the piano Christina once played now untouched. Her scarf remained folded on a chair, her reading glasses sat on the windowsill. Nothing had been moved, as if Clint couldn't bring himself to erase her presence. The tragedy is not only the loss of Christina, but the pattern it revealed. Over the years, Clint has outlived many of the people who shaped him: his parents, his longtime co-stars, his closest collaborators, and partners like Sandra Locke. He has survived nearly everyone, and the silence left behind is deafening. Even his children, though present in his life, remain scattered, emotionally as well as geographically. Some are close enough for public appearances, like his son Scott or his daughter Allison. Others stay private, mentioned rarely, their relationships complicated by distance and time. For a man who played fathers on screen with such conviction, his real family ties were always more fragile. And yet, despite grief, despite solitude, Clint Eastwood refuses to stop creating. In 2024, he released Juror No. 2, widely expected to be his final film. But those who know him best believe he is already planning another. "I'll work as long as I'm still learning," he once said, a line that captures not ambition but survival. Directing is not a job for Clint. it is the way he endures the silence. Now, at Mission Ranch, his days pass quietly. He walks the gardens. He practices meditation. Sometimes he sits on the porch, a script in hand, watching the horizon as though waiting for something he knows won't return. To fans, his solitude looks peaceful. To those closer, it looks heavier. A lifetime of choices, regrets, and unspoken words hangs in the air. Clint himself once admitted, "The hardest thing isn't losing someone, it's knowing you helped push them away." At 95, that truth lingers more than ever. For all the Oscars, for all the unforgettable roles, the weight of Clint Eastwood's later years is not his frailty. It is his solitude. And that, more than anything else, is the tragedy of a man who stood taller than anyone, but now sits alone in the quiet of a house filled with ghosts. Clint Eastwood's story is unlike any other in Hollywood. He rose from a restless child of the Great Depression to become one of the most recognizable faces in the world. He survived rejection, hardship, and even a near-fatal plane crash to carve out a career that spanned 7 decades. He was the cowboy without a name, the detective who never blinked, and the director who turned regret into art. His films changed cinema, and his presence reshaped how audiences understood strength. But his private life tells a different story. Love that began with faith often ended in betrayal. Families formed but rarely stayed whole. Children were raised in fragments, some close, others distant. Relationships that once burned bright collapsed into silence, leaving wounds that time never fully healed. Even in his later years, when he finally seemed to find peace with Christina Sandera, loss returned once again. At 95, Clint Eastwood is a man surrounded not by scandal, but by absence. And perhaps that is the deepest tragedy. For all his triumphs, for all the resilience he showed the world, Clint Eastwood's greatest battles were never on screen. They were in the quiet corners of his life. The piano left untouched, the family gatherings where he stood a little apart, the memories of people who never came back. His discipline gave him longevity. His films gave him immortality. But his heart, marked by distance and regret, carries a weight no camera could ever capture. Yet even in this heartbreak lies the truth of why Clint Eastwood mattered. He was never the flawless hero. He was a man flawed, scarred, and enduring. He showed audiences that courage does not always roar. Sometimes it survives in silence, that strength can exist even when love is lost. That resilience can carry you to 95, but it cannot shield you from loneliness. Clint Eastwood's tragedy is not that he grew old. It is that even after shaping generations through his work, the man behind the legend remains quietly, achingly alone. And in that solitude we see what makes him timeless, not perfection, not invincibility, but humanity. For more emotional stories, check out this video.